As the baby boomers' time in the spotlight fades, so will the political comparisons to the Vietnam War years. Of course, that means we'll be stuck with Iraq War syndrome as my fellow millennials take power, but we can beat that dead horse later. The Vietnam War is an all-consuming reference point for the baby boomers, and for good reason. It was the last war that the US fought with conscripted soldiers and arguably the last, and possibly first, to ever actually kill a president's political career. But the Vietnam War was just a single, though very large, part of an even bigger war that historians have taken to calling the Second Indochina War. The First Indochina War was a set of interconnected wars of independence against French colonialism in Southeast Asia. The Second Indochina War was a set of interconnected civil wars between communists and anti-communists that eventually resulted in communist victories in all three countries. This was shortly followed by the Third Indochina War, fought between China and Vietnam over influence over Southeast Asia, the results of which are a bit more complicated. The Laotian Civil War, which was a constituent part of the Second Indochina War, is either entirely subsumed as a minor theater of the Vietnam War or as the CIA's secret war in English-language sources. I personally don't like writing off these smaller conflicts as just proxy wars because although they feel like proxy wars to the big superpowers, for the people involved on the ground, they were very real and had their own local considerations. But that label doesn't come from nowhere. So let's get started and take a look at the Laotian Civil War. Between the 1850s and 1880s, the French conquered the various kingdoms of Southeast Asia, which collectively were called Indochina, a term coined to describe its location between China and India. Of the three modern countries of Indochina, Laos received the least attention from the French. Similar to colonies like Uganda, this meant that its indigenous institutions and culture remained largely intact throughout the colonial period. But that meant that it was more economically backward than its neighbors Vietnam and Cambodia, whom the French took a greater interest in, as well as Thailand, which managed to modernize just enough to avoid being conquered by the Europeans. Most modern national identities around the world were formed in response to colonialism, and it's the same for Laos, but the context of it is a bit different. Whereas most nationalist identities were born out of opposition to their European colonizers, the light touch of French colonialism in Laos resulted in a later development of a Laotian national identity, and it was developed in response to Thai nationalism in the 1930s and 40s, which sought to conquer much of Laos and Cambodia in order to restore the borders of an older empire. When World War II comes around, at first the Vichy government is allowed to continue governing Indochina, while the Japanese are allowed to occupy and economically exploit the territory. But as the tide of war turned against the Axis powers, the Japanese took more direct control, formally overthrowing the colonial government in March of 1945 and declaring independence for the states of Indochina. The monarchy sided with the French against independence, while the nationalists sided with the Japanese. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Chinese nationalist forces occupied northern Indochina, while British soldiers occupied the south, both of whom disarmed the Japanese soldiers. But whereas the British actively aided the French in re-establishing their control over southern Indochina, the Chinese actively hindered the return of French colonial rule, allowing the communist-dominated Viet Minh to gain control of parts of Vietnam. The nationalists had less popular support in Laos than they did in Cambodia or Vietnam, with the Laotian monarchy wanting the French to retake political control. The Viet Minh would support various Laotian independence factions, but these were mostly present in the two major cities, with the rest of Laos being overwhelmingly rural and conservative. As the Viet Minh revolted in Vietnam, the French would try to maintain loyalty in Laos by offering more and more autonomy within the French Union, establishing a national legislature and adopting a constitution in 1947, and Laos would be granted complete self-rule in 1949, in hopes of heading off what happened in China later that year. It is impossible to overstate just how much the communist takeover of China impacted early Cold War foreign policy. McCarthyism, domino theory, and the Vietnam War are all direct consequences of what US policymakers saw as a failure of intelligence and intervention. And it wasn't without reason, because Communist China began giving aid to the Viet Minh, which was dominated by its communist sub-factions led by Ho Chi Minh. This is why first the Truman administration, and later Eisenhower, supported the French in the First Indochina War, despite ostensibly opposing the continuation of colonialism. There were even fears that prematurely ending the war in Korea might lead to China redirecting its forces to Southeast Asia. The Viet Minh believed that Vietnam would never be able to sustain its independence so long as Laos or Cambodia were still under foreign domination, so they sought to expand the war. They first did so by disbanding the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1951 in order for more nationally oriented movements to take hold in Laos and Cambodia. This was important in Laos because the Laotians, especially the peoples of the borderland hill tribes, hated the Vietnamese and saw the Communist Party as a Vietnamese movement. So the Laotian communists formed the Pathet Lao, which although nominally independent, was functionally subordinate to the Communist Party in Hanoi. This was followed by the Viet Minh invading northeastern Laos in 1953, hoping to divert French forces away from Vietnam. The French would eventually give up in Southeast Asia, which would set off a domino effect across the world, but those are stories for other times. They would negotiate a peace deal with the Viet Minh, and thanks to Prince Souphanophong of Laos, the Pathet Lao were also given a seat at the tables in Geneva. The resulting accords would partition Vietnam into North and South, while the Pathet Lao were allowed to remain armed and in control of the northern provinces of Hao Phang and Phong Sa-Li, which bordered communist northern Vietnam, who would continue to funnel soldiers and supplies. The accords created a tenuous peace between the Vietnamese-backed communists in the north and a coalition of liberals and royalists in the south. I'll get back to the story in a second, because right now I want to tell you that the Casual Historian 2025 audience survey is now live. Every year, I create a survey using Google Forms in order to get information about my audience, such as demographics, their social media habits, as well as what topics and kinds of videos they'd be interested in seeing. I use this data to make business decisions and help create videos that I hope you guys will enjoy and improve your experience here. So if you're a regular viewer of my videos and you would like to have a say in what kinds of videos I make in the future, I would appreciate it if you went down to the description and clicked on the survey link and filled that out for me. But with that out of the way, let's get back to the history. The Eisenhower administration feared what might happen if communism was allowed to expand unchallenged in Indochina, with the fall of China being quickly followed by the invasion of South Korea and the communist takeover of northern Vietnam and Laos. Domino theory appeared very real. The loss of all Vietnam, together with Laos on the west and Cambodia in the southwest, would have meant the surrender to communist enslavement of millions. On the material side, it would have spelled the loss of valuable deposits of tin and prodigious supplies of rubber and rice. It would have meant that Thailand, enjoying buffer territory between itself and Red China, would be exposed on its entire eastern border to infiltration or attack. And if Indochina fell, not only Thailand but Burma and Malaya would be threatened, with added risk to East Pakistan and South Asia, as well as to all Indonesia. Initially, his administration would focus primarily on Vietnam, but as the decade progressed, he came to see the importance of Laos as a wall protecting the rest of Southeast Asia. And he wasn't the only one who recognized its importance. And Eisenhower wasn't the only one to see Laos's importance, as Communist China began reaching out to the Laotian government, offering to build up its transportation infrastructure, which was seen as China trying to win support amongst the rural Lao. As for its regional neighbors, both North Vietnam and Thailand saw Laos as a buffer zone against the other, with Hanoi fearing Laos would be used by the West and Thailand to prevent their reconquest of the South. To help protect Laos, the US and UK would form a new regional alliance, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, consisting of the US, UK, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines, and Pakistan. Like its name implies, it was intended to be an eastern counterpart to NATO. The Geneva Accords of 1954 formally prevented the former states of Indochina from joining any military alliances, but separate treaties were signed between SEATO members and Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam in order to extend the alliance's umbrella of protection. In addition to treaty protections, the US would try to protect Laos by building up the kingdom's military. Initially, French and Thai officers were training the Laotians, but in 1955 the US began providing aid to the royalist government. 80% of US aid went to the military, which functionally became the entire military budget. Unfortunately, the US diplomatic staff in Laos was insufficient to keep a close eye on how the money was being spent, resulting in corruption amongst Laotian politicians and officers. Over the course of the decade, the French would reduce its aid contributions to Laos, completely cutting them off by 1958, which was quickly supplanted by American aid. This was mirrored by the Army when it came to training, which saw American officers take over from French ones, as they reorganized the Laotian army along modern Western lines, focusing on conventional set-piece warfare. By 1960, the Laotian army was about 30,000 strong. Laos's internal politics were dominated by the three princes, the half-brothers Souphanophong and Salvanophama, and Prince Baum of the Kingdom of Champasak, which agreed to become part of Laos in exchange for Baum receiving a lifetime appointment as Inspector General. Souphanophong was the political leader of the leftists, and was a secret member of the Pathet Lao, often receiving orders from the Communist Party in Hanoi. Van Oom was a symbolic leader of the rightists and royalists. Suvarnabhuma, who had become prime minister, was the leader of the neutralist faction that wanted Laos to remain neutral in the Cold War, and flirted with joining the non-aligned movement. Phalma's strategy to keep Laos from becoming a battlefield in the Cold War was to form a coalition government consisting of all three factions, hoping that each having a seat at the table would satiate them enough to not seek outside intervention. This strategy would ultimately fail due to the Pathet Lao refusing to disarm or to allow the royalist government to resume administration of the northern provinces. This failure to regain control of the north led to Phalma's ousting in October of 1954, but the elections in late 1955 brought him back to office on a promise to negotiate the return of the northern provinces to royal authority and the integration of the Pathet Lao into the royal army. A tripartite coalition would be formed in November 1957 as a precondition for a return of the provinces, with the US continuing to provide aid in spite of its opposition of working with the communists. Instead, the US would support the non-communist politicians running in the 1958 elections through Operation Booster Shot, which consisted of getting material aid to Laotian peasants, dissuading them from voting for the communists. The elections would result in the anti-communist Rally Party coalition winning 36 of 59 seats. A series of crises in the summer of 1958 would result in the second ousting of Phalma from the premiership. The Laotian army continued to clash with the communists in the northeast, while the Pathet Lao continued to stall their integration into the regular army. This was compounded with a fiscal crisis, when the US cut off economic aid to the government unless they devalued their currency, the kip. I'll give a fuller explanation later, but the US wanted to cut down on the amount of corruption happening in Laos that their foreign aid was enabling. They feared it might foster a popular uprising, and this corruption was mostly enabled by an overvalued kip that was part of a currency exchange program. To regain US aid, Phalma would resign the premiership in August of 1958, being succeeded by Phawi Sananikone, who was pro-American and promised massive reforms to civil service and military promotions in order to root out corruption. He would exclude the leftists from his cabinet and brought in his political party, the Committee for Defense of National Interests, or CDNI. The legislature would grant Phawi special powers to govern unilaterally. This allowed him to dissolve the National Assembly and make the desired reforms to keep American aid coming. He also arrested and hunted down the Pathet Lao, forcing many out of the country and into hiding in North Vietnam. By December of 1959, Phao felt that he had succeeded in his goals, having allowed the National Assembly to reconvene, and renounced his special powers. But the National Assembly would vote to extend his powers until the next legislative elections were held in April of 1960. Around this time, Phawi was also planning to remove the CDNI from his cabinet. On December 31st, 1959, the CDNI, led by Defense Minister Phalmi Nosavan, would orchestrate a bloodless coup ousting Phawi. The king would sanction the coup and appointed royal council member Cao Abhay as the interim prime minister until new elections could be held in May 1960. The CDNI would use their newly unrestrained position to rig that election via gerrymandering, candidate rejection, bribery, and intimidation, electing Prince Somsaneth as prime minister. These coups might feel like they're coming out of nowhere, but they make a little more sense when you realize that Laos had just been invaded by North Vietnam. The 1954 Geneva Accord allowed a period of time for people in either North or South Vietnam to migrate to the other, which resulted in many families being split up. A prominent communist within the Viet Minh, Le Duan, had decided to stay in the South after the Accords in order to organize a network of communist spies and insurgents to be called upon later. Le Duan would return to Hanoi in 1958 and began advocating a campaign to liberate the South, but he had to overcome the influence of both Vong Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh himself. When you read about the history of successful communist revolutions, you eventually reach a point where the communists are divided on what to do next. Do you build up the industrial and economic capacity of this country in order to preserve the revolution there? Or do you strike while the iron is hot and try to expand the revolution beyond your borders in order to create a buffer zone between your socialist core and the forces of counter-revolution abroad? This debate is usually framed as the Stalinists versus the Trotskyites. And granted, when you look into the nitty-gritty of these debates, you realize it's a bit more complicated than that, but for our purposes, it is a useful enough framework to build on. In the Vietnamese context, Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap are the Stalinists, who believe in socialism in one country, and thus wanted to build up the strength of North Vietnam before spreading the revolution, while Le Duan was the Trotskyite who wanted to spread the revolution before the forces of reaction could regroup. Well, Stalin won the original debate back in the 1920s, but at the party conference of November of 1958, Le Duan and the Trotskyites won, with the party approving a resolution to liberate South Vietnam. In December of 1958, 2 battalions of North Vietnamese troops were sent into the Savannakhet province. This was the initial impetus for the National Assembly to give Prime Minister Phaoui special powers, which were used to arrest and hunt down the Pathet Lao, who were seen as collaborators and agents of Hanoi. North Vietnamese troops would eventually be expelled from Savannakhet, but more would be sent into the northern provinces controlled by the Pathet Lao. In addition to the invasion of Laos, North Vietnam would also create 2 secret divisions. One consisted of South Vietnamese who had migrated to the north after the Geneva Accords and would be sent back to the south to create an insurgency against Saigon, forming the Viet Cong. The other was the Military Transportation Group 559, or MTG 559. They would be tasked with constructing and expanding a series of roads and trails through eastern Laos and Cambodia, through which North Vietnam could move troops and supplies to the communist insurgents in South Vietnam. To Hanoi, it would be known as Strategic Route 559, but in Western media, it would be dubbed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. North Vietnam hadn't told the Soviet Union nor the South Vietnamese communists about the plan to invade right away, hoping to avoid information getting leaked, and forcing the Soviets into a position where they had to support them. Within the communist world, a divide was already forming between the USSR and China, and the Vietnamese Communist Party wanted to exploit the fissure by forcing Moscow and Beijing into outbidding each other to win Hanoi's allegiance. The Hanoi-backed insurgency by the Pathet Lao intensified in the summer of 1959, with Defense Minister Phaoui Nossavan declaring martial law. And so it would be pretty easy to portray the CDNI coup as just a cynical means to retain power, but when you realize that the Prime Minister was giving up powers when the cabinet and the legislature both thought that the job he needed to do wasn't done, paints the picture a bit more complicated. By the summer of 1960, things were still messy in Laos. The Pathet Lao, backed heavily by North Vietnamese manpower and material, was expanding communist control of the country, and the promised anti-corruption reforms of Phaoui and the CDNI had failed to bear fruits. So in August of 1960, a captain in the Laotian army, Kong Lee, led a paratrooper battalion into the capital of Vientiane, taking control of numerous governmental ministries and the radio station. Kong Lee was an uneducated officer who had proven himself in battle, rising through the ranks despite his origin in the minority Lao Thuong ethnic group. Kong Lee would get the National Assembly to censure Prime Minister Som Son Sith, who would step down in favor of Phauma returning to the premiership, who subsequently kicked the CDNI out of the government and attempted to form another coalition with the leftists. The US is uncertain of how to react to the coup and whether it had actually had the king's support, like Phaomi's had the previous December. Ambassador Winthrop Brown was sympathetic to Kong Lee, while the CIA, still riding on successful regime change efforts in Guatemala and Iran, supported ousting them. Phauma would try to assuage the rightists by bringing Phaomi into his cabinet, appointing him as deputy prime minister. But Phaomi had wanted to retain his position as defense minister, which gave him control of the military, and thus a de facto veto over any decision the prime minister might make. Phaomi would form an alliance with Prince Baum Om, who began recruiting and training soldiers in the province of Savannakhet, receiving aid from the CIA, while Thailand placed an unofficial blockade on Laos. But before we continue, I would like to take a moment to thank the channel members and patrons for helping keeping Casual Historian going. These supporters help keep the channel going when the algorithm or the sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And quite frankly, I would prefer to be a little more dependent on direct support of viewers than on AdSense. Supporters get a number of perks, such as access to an exclusive Discord server, as well as getting your name and the scrolling chyron at the end of videos, as well as early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos. And depending on which level or tier you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make the videos, as well as the notes that I use to make those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know that most people who choose to support me or any other creator is because they think what we do has value. They like the videos we make and they want to see us make more and better. And with your support, we can. And so if you believe that you do get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then I would suggest becoming a channel supporter. You could click the join button below this video, or you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and choose a membership tier that's right for you. The current difference between channel memberships and Patreon is that at the moment, Patreon has more options in case you want to give additional support. And Patreon also offers annual subscriptions, whereas channel memberships at the moment only offer month to month. So thanks to all the patrons and channel members, past, present, and future, for supporting this channel and making these videos possible. But for now, let's get back to the history. The US tried to dissuade Falma from working with the Laotian left, but the Prime Minister was certain that this was the only path to avoid civil war. The US would respond by cutting its aid to Falma's government, warning that his talks with the Pathet Lao needed to stop. They would come to a temporary compromise where the US would continue delivering aid to the Laotian government, but they would continue sending arms to Phalmi and Bao Om's army in Savannah Ket. This, however, was done under the pretense that they were only going to target the Pathet Lao. Phalma would begin reaching out to the Soviets for arms, to which the US would respond by finally cutting off its aid in November of 1960. And Kong Lee would start receiving aid from the Soviets in December. On December 8, 1960, another coup, led by Colonel Kuprasith Abhay, tried to oust Kong Lee and Phalma. Kong Lee managed to regain control of the capital by the end of the day, but the Prime Minister had fled to neighboring Cambodia. Phalma's Minister of the Interior, Quinem Fulsena, would flee to North Vietnam, who agreed to send them arms and supplies. Abhay fled the capital to meet up with Phalma, whose troops had been slowly moving northward since late November. On December 12th, the National Assembly had convened in the royal capital of Luang Prabang, where they voted no confidence in Phalma's government, and thus giving Phalmi the political cover he needed to attack the capital, where his and Kong Lee's forces fought for 4 days, where the city's old wood neighborhoods went up in flames. By December 16th, Kong Lee's forces retreated from the capital to a plateau north of the city on the Plain of Jars. Once there, he links up with the Pathet Lao, and both began receiving direct aid from the Soviets and North Vietnamese. Hanoi began sending in more fighters into Laos, while Pathet Lao forces began moving west towards Chiang Khong, and another force from Phang Saleh moving south. This series of coups turned into a crisis in the White House. Communist insurgencies in neighboring South Vietnam, Malaysia, Burma, and Indonesia made the CIA believe a communist takeover of Laos was imminent, leading the National Security Council to begin drafting plans for a ground invasion of Laos by US forces. Manifestly, the loss of Indochina would have been equally disastrous. We as a nation could not stand aloof, unless we were ready to allow free nations to crumble one by one under communist pressure. Eisenhower ordered the 7th Fleet to move toward the Gulf of Thailand, while encouraging Prime Minister Phalma, who was still sheltering in Cambodia, to formally resign his premiership so a new government could be formed. Emergency meetings suggested sending US Marines and paratroopers into Vientiane and Luang Prabang, but Eisenhower refused, in part in order to not saddle an incoming President Kennedy with a last-minute war, but also because he believed that if the US should intervene, it should go all in. On January 2, 1961, the French government told the administration that they wouldn't support the US effort to replace Phalma Savannah as Prime Minister. Eisenhower wrote a personal message for President de Gaulle, pointing to the obvious foreign backing of the Pathet Lao insurgency, but he still refused. We cannot let Laos fall to the communists even if we have to fight, with our allies or without. As Kennedy's transition team begins ingratiating itself into the White House, Eisenhower brings the president-elect into the national security meetings, where he emphasizes the immense importance of what's going on in Laos. He reportedly gave Laos a higher level of importance than Berlin, Cuba, or even the arms race. The Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a contingency plan to send 60,000 troops into Laos if the situation remained chaotic, and once Kennedy was inaugurated, he placed the Marines stationed in Okinawa on high alert, with a small contingent sent to Thailand to respond if immediate action was needed. JFK was under the impression that the Pathet Lao had more support than it really did. In reality, most people in Laos, as well as most national leaders in the region, saw the Pathet Lao as puppets of Hanoi. But Kennedy was skeptical about the efficacy of a war in Southeast Asia based on a trip to Saigon he attended as a member of the House of Representatives in 1951. And after the Bay of Pigs, he was doubly dubious about the effectiveness of the CIA. All of these would push the president to support a negotiated settlement in Laos. The administration would come to support the neutralist faction in Laos, which became a possibility after Prince Phalma returned from exile in Cambodia. The Soviets were also supportive of a negotiated settlement, which saw an international conference held in Geneva in January 1962. The left, right, and neutralist factions agreed to equal representation within the government. The new accord saw all the signatories agree to pull their forces out of Laos, and reiterated most of the same points of the 1954 accords. They will not introduce into the Kingdom of Laos foreign troops or military personnel in any form whatsoever. They will not establish, nor will they in any way facilitate or connive at the establishment in the Kingdom of Laos of any foreign military base, foreign strongpoint, or foreign military installation of any kind. They will not use the territory of the Kingdom of Laos for interference in the internal affairs of other countries. They will not use the territory of any country, including their own, for interference in the internal affairs of the Kingdom of Laos. All foreign and irregular troops, foreign paramilitary formations, and foreign military personnel shall be withdrawn from Laos in the short time possible. However, the Accords continued to allow the Pathet Lao to remain in control of the northern provinces of Laos, and they refused to allow outside observers into their territory, which meant there could never be confirmation of whether North Vietnam complied with the Accords, which they didn't. In fact, they would send in more troops and arms, while Thailand and the US withdrew their uniformed personnel. The agreement also led Suvarnabhuma back to the premiership, from where he would try to negotiate a reintegration of the northern provinces. But while Kennedy was trying to arrange a diplomatic resolution, the CIA was taking account for communist duplicity. In the waning weeks of the Eisenhower administration, the CIA approved a secret mission in Laos, Operation Momentum. The Laotian army had proven ineffective at fighting the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese. They couldn't be maintained in the field as long and weren't as familiar with the terrain, but a CIA officer stationed in Thailand, Bill Lair, suggested working with the Hmong hill tribes, and in particular, a man named Vang Pao. The Hmong are a semi-nomadic peoples from southern China and Southeast Asia, with sizable diaspora populations in the West today. They migrate across the mountains of Southeast Asia, setting up a village for a few years with subsistence farms, and would move on when the soil was depleted. The Hmong had no written language and practiced their own native animist religions rather than Buddhism. The French attempted numerous times to bring them under their authority, but eventually gave up, earning a begrudging respect for the Hmong as fighters. So much so that the Hmong fought with the French against the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War. A fiercely independent people, the Hmong saw the communists as a bigger threat to their way of life than the French or the Laotian monarchy. Having already recognized their utility, the Laotian army would begin arming the Hmong guerrillas in 1957. Vang Pao was a Hmong officer who had proven himself a talented tactician, as well as someone who had the charisma to unite a large swath of the difficult-to-corral Hmong. Pao had fought with the French against the Japanese in World War II as well as against the Viet Minh, developing a deep hatred for the Vietnamese, who killed many of his friends and family during the War of Independence. Both Pao and the Hmong earned a reputation as great fighters, as well as for brutality, refusing to take prisoners, and unafraid to torture the few captives they did take. The Hmong were among the poorest peoples of Laos, poorer than the peasants of the lowlands. Thousands of refugees had fled from areas controlled by the communists. They feared reprisal from the Vietnamese for having sided with the French against independence in the First War. Bill Lair saw the Hmong as the ideal fighting force for combating the communists. Between their knowledge of and ability to live off the land, as well as their vested interest in fighting off both the communists and the Vietnamese, they were exactly what the CIA was looking for. Operation Momentum would be given a budget of $5 million, and would use Thai mercenaries to train 1,000 Hmong fighters and provide them with arms, food, and medicine. Either we fight or leave. If you give me weapons, we fight. Prior to this, the CIA's activities mostly consisted of intelligence operations and assisting local regime change efforts. But the Laotian Civil War would be their first attempt at running a war, which would serve as a blueprint for future operations in Africa and Asia. The war was the reverse image of the Vietnam War. In Laos, we were the guerrillas. The Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese army held some of the towns and most of the roads. One of the most frustrating aspects of the war in Laos was North Vietnam's insistence that they didn't have any troops in the country, and the Pathet Lao's refusal to allow outside observers allowed them to politically maintain this fiction. And when Vietnamese troops were captured, Hanoi proclaimed them to be volunteers who went to Laos of their own accord, and much of the international system was willing to go along with it. The North Vietnamese brazenly insisted that they had no forces in the country, and such military activity that might occur there was a result of justifiable resistance. A great many of the young journalists of the Western press, whose sympathies were against what they regarded as establishment regimes in Vientiane and Saigon, were quite prepared to accept the Lao Dong fabrications and publish them as fact. From the moment the Geneva Accords were signed, the Kennedy administration didn't believe North Vietnam would uphold its end of the agreement. So he continued Operation Momentum, all the while sending more advisors to South Vietnam, believing it was the only means to hold Hanoi accountable. The Kennedy administration, and subsequently the Johnson administration, became rather skeptically resigned to the situation, Rather than attempting to convince world opinion of the perfidy of Hanoi, we decided to fight the Lao Dong on its own terms in South Vietnam, and let the consequences of North Vietnam's defeat work its own rectification of the problem in Laos. The main goal of U.S. involvement in Laos, that being protecting Western allies, remained the top priority for Kennedy in Southeast Asia.
It's important as a sovereign power, people desire to be independent, and it's also important because it borders the Mekong River, and quite obviously if Laos fell into communist hands, it would increase the danger along the northern frontiers of Thailand, would put additional pressure in Cambodia, and would put additional pressure in South Vietnam, which themselves would put additional pressure on Malaya. So I do accept the view that there is an interrelationship in these countries, and that's why one of the reasons why we're concerned with maintaining the Geneva Accords as a method of maintaining stability in Southeast Asia. It may be one of the reasons why others do not share that interest.
Hanoi's flagrant violation of the Accords left the Kennedy administration with little remorse for secretly arming the Hmong. The administration continued sending weapons to Vang Pao's fighters, as well as sending some of them to train in Thailand as pilots. They had numerous successes against the North Vietnamese with hit-and-run attacks, as well as repelling numerous advances. By the spring of 1963, Pao had about 20,000 troops under his command. They were capable of attacking the Pathet Lao stronghold of Sam Noya in early 1963. With their success earning Vang Pao the rank of general within the Laotian army, which drew more fighters, both Hmong and Lao, to join his forces. The Hmong who constituted the bulk of the manpower had, in the space of 2.5 years, undergone a transformation. Tribal irregulars previously uncomprehending of any technique or tactic beyond ambush at the approaches to one's own village could now be deployed, in relatively large units, far from home. With some expert help, they could mount a sophisticated, coordinated offensive operation. As the Hmong demonstrated their prowess on the battlefield, some policymakers wanted to elevate their role in the war. Don't ever let the locals think mighty America will fight their battles or solve all their problems for them. Focus on getting them ready to fix their own problems. Kennedy's death wouldn't stop Operation Momentum, with funding for it increasing under Lyndon Johnson. Vang Pao's battlefield success led him to demanding more air power, believing he could drive out the North Vietnamese with additional air cover. The U.S. was reluctant to give full air support for fear of exposing CIA operations in the region, but Johnson became more open as Hanoi increased incursions into South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through Laos. Vang Pao would tell the new U.S. ambassador, William Sullivan, as well as the CIA station chief, that the Hmong were capable of more conventional operations, such as year-round fighting, as well as capturing and holding territory, so long as they received the needed arms and supplies. Operation Momentum had begun to drastically impact Hmong society, with Vang Pao using his control over rice distribution to buy support and manpower from the various tribes, clans, and family of the Hmong. Many of the Hmong who had relied on subsistence farming became dependent on rice deliveries from the U.S. as more became concentrated in refugee camps after fleeing communist attacks. The increased concentration of people in towns resulted in a rise of prostitution amongst the Hmong, which had been rare beforehand. Village and clan elders complained about the younger Hmong growing up around Vang Pao's camp, claiming that they were losing the ability to live off the land. Pao would tell these elders that they had no choice but to work with the Americans because Hanoi would never forgive the Hmong for having sided with the French. Vang Pao would begin building a personality cult around him, while turning the struggle against the communists into a holy war, claiming to receive dreams from spirits and gods that told him to ally even closer with the Americans. Operation Momentum, which had begun as a defensive operation against communist advances, had now become an offensive one, with CIA operators taking a more hands-on role in training the Hmong fighters. Hmong troops would begin fortifying towns and villages in hopes of luring communists into traps. The Johnson administration's hope was that increased fighting in Laos would divert North Vietnamese forces away from South Vietnam, and that's something to keep in mind about U.S. operations in Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War. It was all in service of preventing the fall of Saigon, and preventing another set of dominoes from falling. And the Johnson administration kept that in mind when it escalated the war in Laos. In 1963, Prince Souphanouvong would seek sanctuary in Pathet Lao territory, while Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces drove the last of Kong Lee's forces off the plain of Jars, which functionally ended the armed wing of the neutralist faction. This resulted in Prime Minister Phalma to authorize the U.S. to independently target communist forces in Laos, who would then begin targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail with Operation Barrel Roll. And LBJ would let Ambassador Bill Sullivan be his point man on the ground, who would become the most powerful ambassador of the Cold War, actively ordering bombing raids in a country the U.S. was not officially involved in. Bill Sullivan was a longtime supporter of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and had worked with Averell Harriman during the negotiations of the 1962 Geneva Accords. And it was his role in a secret committee wargaming session that explored the importance of Laos to the U.S. Southeast Asia strategy that led Johnson to appoint him ambassador there. The White House would constantly encourage Sullivan to take more money for operations in the country and granted him massive leeway in ordering military operations, going so far as to reject General Westmoreland's plans that involved Laos. By late 1964, the mechanism for our secret war was largely in place. For the next 4.5 years, I directed that war, and in that period, gradually increased our operations in response to more aggressive North Vietnamese intervention. I eventually came to live with the task on a 24-hour-a-day basis. As experience accumulated and as the months and years went by, I eventually carried in my head, just short of my subconscious, a working knowledge of our deployments, the terrain, the roads and trails, the enemy dispositions, and our aircraft availability. U.S. ground operations would escalate after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, with President Johnson wanting to avoid the condemnation Truman received after the fall of China. Ambassador Sullivan advocated using American bombers to hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the head of Operation Momentum, Bill Lair, opposed the war's expansion, believing the Hmong were not suited to a conventional war. Despite this, the bombings of Laos would begin in May of 1964, with pilots soon discovering that the country wasn't very well mapped and that the dense foliage made it difficult to target the movement of communist troops. And although the US government was bombing Laos with the permission of its government, they didn't always inform the Laotian government of when or where these attacks were going to happen. The war would soon be expanded into Cambodia due to King Sihanouk's allowing China to deliver arms to the Viet Cong via the port of Sihanoukville. This coincided with China giving the path at Lao aid along the Sino-Laotian border, while Indonesia was training troops loyal to Kong Lee, and the North Koreans were training North Vietnamese fighter pilots. And Johnson feared that the North Koreans were waiting for American troops to pull out of South Vietnam before they launched their own attack on South Korea. While the US and the Hmong were fighting their own wars against the communists, Laotian politicians were willing to use armed forces against each other. Local commanders of the Laotian army were often closely aligned to a particular politician or family, and would come to blows with commanders loyal to others. One incident saw an Air Force chief from Savannakhet bomb the home of a rival general as well as the army headquarters with T-28 bombers, and then fly them off into exile in Thailand. In April 1964, General Siho Lampothikul attempted to oust Suvarna Phalma from the premiership, but failed. General Phalmi Nosavan would be blamed for the failed coup despite not being involved, leading him to be dismissed from the position of defense minister. Phalmi would then retaliate in August of 1964 by launching an actual coup, which was quickly put down, with the division he launched it with being dissolved afterward. Phalmi attempted another coup in January 1965, after which he would also flee to Thailand. Bill Sullivan would have a much better relationship with the CIA than any of his predecessors in Laos. Whereas most diplomats distrusted the CIA, seeing their operations as interfering with their jobs as representing the US government. The CIA would end up having more representatives in Laos than the State Department, and in turn the CIA was very transparent with Ambassador Sullivan, his cooperation earning him the nickname Field Marshal from Westmoreland. But as the budget and scope of Operation Momentum expanded, the quality of the CIA recruits sent there declined, as they had no interest in learning the language or cultures of the region. Laos became the fast track for promotion within the CIA due to the relative free hand they were given in the country, in contrast to Europe, where the military and State Department had final say on all policy. The CIA also became more dependent on private contractors, who were not officially employees of the CIA, and thus created cover for CIA operations in the region outside of South Vietnam. This policy would later allow the White House to claim that the American death toll in Laos was lower than it actually was. As the war in Vietnam dragged on, the Johnson administration began to rely more and more on bombing, and developed several strategies around a funnel metaphor, in which they could target either the supplies headed for the Viet Cong at the entry point in Laos, inside the funnel along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or at the exit point, with the State and Defense Departments favoring the third option, which posed a lower risk of dragging China into the conflict, while the Joint Chiefs of Staff supported heading the top of the funnel, continuing to bomb North Vietnam. LBJ would try to compromise the two by continuing to bomb the north, while also hitting the bottom of the funnel, but with a few exceptions kept Hanoi itself off the target list. The increased bombing runs over Laos increased expectations of the Hmong, who were now expected to attack the communists during the wet seasons. The Laos would also be hit by the Tet Offensive in January 1968, with the Hmong targeted in the Halphon province, who had abandoned their positions after taking severe casualties. The North Vietnamese were able to dedicate more resources to fighting in Laos due to President Johnson halting the bombing of North Vietnam, for which the U.S. compensated with intensified bombings in Laos. By the start of the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao had been besieging the Hmong-defended town of Nam Bach for a year. Bill Lair had advised against the strategy of putting the Hmong in fortified locations in hopes of setting up traps for Hanoi, pointing out the same strategy had failed the French at Dien Bien Phu. No matter how much aid they gave to defenders, nor how much they bombed the besiegers, the communists couldn't be dislodged. On January 13, 1968, the defense of Nam Bach collapsed, with the defenders fleeing, abandoning millions of dollars of equipment, with 2,400 of them captured, with many of those who escaped deserting. It was later discovered that the defenders had actually outnumbered the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces. The fall of Nam Bach was followed by rapid communist advances, overrunning numerous Hmong strongholds, leading to tens of thousands of Hmong refugees fleeing to the south. LBJ would approve another bombing halt against North Vietnam, while Hanoi promised not to violate the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. Despite all the setbacks, Vang Pao would be given the command of the whole Laotian army in northeastern Laos, though the Laotian army proper was hardly involved in the war in the north anyways. During the dry season of 1968-69, the North Vietnamese would concentrate their attacks on the Hmong, due to them being the most effective anti-communist forces in the country, waging a scorched earth campaign and razing villages that refused to cooperate, much of which U.S. bombing would be blamed for. Out of office, Nixon became a critic of the Kennedy and Johnson administration policies in Southeast Asia, arguing for intensified bombing of the North, believing force was the only language communist aggression understood, and absolutely opposed any negotiations with the Viet Cong. Prior to the election, some in Nixon's orbit had been encouraging him to expand the war into Laos and Cambodia, and after winning the election in 1968, he would be given the chance to roll back the communist advances that his three predecessors couldn't. Prior to 1969, the CIA flew 15 to 20 sorties a day over Laos, but by the end of that year, it numbered about 300, and they would target North Vietnamese and Viet Cong bases in Cambodia as well, which managed to set back infrastructure in Laos by decades. The intensified bombing resulted in Hanoi deploying its most experienced troops to Laos, which Nixon would exploit, leaving North Vietnam's inexperienced troops to fight the South Vietnamese. A 1972 memo written by Nixon reveals his thought process behind the campaign. "I cannot emphasize too strongly that I have determined that we should go for broke. We have the power to destroy the war-making capacity. The only question is whether we have the will to use that power. What distinguishes me from Lyndon Johnson is that I have the will in spades." If you're still watching the video at this point, then you must really enjoy my content, but you might be on the fence about whether or not to support the content, especially on an ongoing monthly basis. Well, luckily for you, we have alternatives. You can give a one-time contribution to Casual Historian via PayPal, or you could buy me a book from my Amazon wishlist. Doing the latter option, not only are you covering the cost of some of my research material, but you'll also be nudging me in the direction of one topic or another, depending on which book you get. Both of those options, as well as a secret third thing, can all be found down in the description below. Thanks for your considerations, and now let's get back to the history. The administration believed that Hanoi was restraining its actions in Laos until they could successfully reconquer the South. Several Johnson-era personnel would be promoted, such as Ambassador Sullivan being elevated to Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, who paired with Kissinger would continue to run the war in Laos. Ted Shackley was promoted from CIA Station Chief in Laos to head of CIA operations in Saigon. The expansion of the war in Cambodia was preceded by the U.S. dealing with the consequences of French colonialism. During the colonial period, the French settled a border dispute between the kings of Cambodia and Vietnam in Vietnam's favor, leaving the Kingdom of Cambodia with a territorial claim on South Vietnam. The King of Cambodia would approve cross-border raids into the disputed territory, which Nixon would respond to by secretly bombing Cambodia in the spring of 1969. And by early 1970, North Vietnam began moving troops into Cambodia. King Sihanouk had allowed the North Vietnamese to base in his territory in exchange for North Vietnam recognizing the Cambodian version of the border. Under the monarchy, Cambodia had allowed the communists to infiltrate the country, with the Chinese delivering arms by sea through ports in the south, as well as the North Vietnamese delivering arms and men via the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the north. So in March of 1970, Prime Minister Lon Nol orchestrated a coup, ousting the king from power and closing the ports to arms shipments from China. King Sihanouk would flee to Beijing, where he would form an alliance with Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge. The closing off of the port to Chinese arms would intensify the fighting along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Nixon administration initially refrained from aiding Lon Nol's regime for fear that the communists would use it as an excuse to invade, but they quickly realized that they already had. We were taken in with the line that by helping him we would destroy his neutrality and give the North Vietnamese an excuse to come in. Over and over again, we failed to learn that the communists never needed an excuse to come in. The North Vietnamese had never formally allied with the Khmer Rouge, preferring to work with King Sihanouk, who allowed them to set up bases and deliver arms to the Viet Cong. But after the coup, Hanoi would begin providing training and equipment to Cambodian communists, but they were quickly supplanted by China. Pol Pot set up an area of control in northeastern Cambodia and the territory controlled by the North Vietnamese. The Khmer Rouge began to round up all the ethnic Lao living there and force them to live in agricultural villages due to many having been semi-nomadic. The Khmer also waged a war against religion, destroying both Buddhist and animist shrines and collectivizing the agriculture of territories they controlled, persecuting the non-Khmer ethnic minorities. This is the background situation the Nixon administration was dealing with when they decided to escalate the bombing of Cambodia. After months of planning, the administration orchestrated an incursion into Laos in February of 1971 during the dry season. While American troops were watching the DMZ, South Vietnamese troops were crossing the border into Laos, hoping to cut off the Viet Cong supply line via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Nixon had wanted the incursion as a means to demonstrate the success of his Vietnamization policy, but the mission was a failure due to U.S. advisors restricted from accompanying them, thanks to the Cooper-Church Amendment passed by Congress. But the expansion of the war didn't alleviate the pressure on the Hmong in Laos. In early 1969, the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao conquered much of northeastern Laos and moved south, stopping short of the Plain of Jars, which lacked the vegetative cover that protected their forces in the rest of the country, yet was ideal for firing mortars at the capital. The Plain of Jars had become the single most bombed part of the country, with the area largely being depopulated by the end of the war, with most of its civilians having fled south. Toward the end of spring, the North Vietnamese had been planning a final offensive to overrun the rest of Laos, leading to the CIA evacuating Vang Pao and his fighters from their bases at Long Cheng. But the rainy season would slow down the communist advance, giving the Hmong an opportunity for an attack on the Plain of Jars. The U.S. Embassy believed such an attack was an act of desperation, while the CIA and the White House believed it could be the knockout blow needed to end the war before it leaked to the public. The attack was launched in August of 1969, with commandos cutting off communist supply lines, followed by an attack from the south, paired with American bombings hitting both the Plain of Jars as well as several strongholds along the border with North Vietnam. Vang Pao managed to capture $12 million in Soviet equipment, with the CIA hoping it would hamper the operations of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, due to people living around the Plain of Jars being involved in transporting goods along it. But the battle would be a Pyrrhic victory for the Hmong. By 1969, Vang Pao had faced difficulty recruiting more fighters. The Hmong suffered the brunt of the North Vietnamese offensive, facing down Hanoi's best soldiers and suffering 70% of the casualties. Nearly 20% of the Hmong population had been killed since 1960. Poor battlefield results since switching to an offensive strategy led many fighters to defect to both the communists in the north as well as to the Laotian army proper, which saw combat less frequently, with many abandoning the military altogether. To fill his dwindling ranks, he was forced to begin recruiting minors as young as 13, and depriving Hmong villages of food aid if they didn't provide manpower. Thailand would send more mercenaries to reinforce Vang Pao, but this couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Vang Pao had hoped that a major battlefield victory would restore morale to his forces and help rebuild them afterwards, but in the battle he lost several battalions worth of troops, leading him to request increased bombing raids from the CIA, hoping to prevent a counterattack by Hanoi. 13,000 additional troops would be sent from North Vietnam to Laos, with the Nixon administration fearing they would capture the entirety of the Mekong Delta, potentially knocking Thailand out of the war, where most raids into Laos and Cambodia were launched from. The North Vietnamese would recapture the Plain of Jars in January of 1970, with the Hmong retreating to Long Cheng, and receiving reinforcements from Thailand while CIA agents in Long Cheng began destroying all evidence of their involvement in Laos, as the White House approved an intensified bombing campaign. The Hmong began fortifying Long Cheng, planting mines and digging trenches. The North Vietnamese start firing missiles at them, defending their own positions with Soviet-provided surface-to-air missiles. By early 1971, the U.S. Embassy assessed that the Hmong were on the verge of collapse, while Vang Pao began toying with the idea of a mass exodus to Thailand. As the siege tightened, the Hmong general became more paranoid, as he used his intelligence network to report suspected traitors and cowards. He had lost any hope of winning another set-piece battle against the communists. The siege campaign continued on and off throughout 1971, with renewed offensives during the dry seasons. More Thai mercenaries were sent, along with regular Laotian army forces, along with an intensified bombing campaign. By April 1972, North Vietnam decided to call off the attack, with Hanoi redirecting its forces for an offensive against South Vietnam. Despite surviving the siege, the situation for Vang Pau's forces worsened. Having already resorted to recruiting teenagers, now recruited preteens, elderly men, and even a handful of women. They went so far as to kidnap young boys from refugee camps. The escalation of fighting in both Laos and Cambodia would eventually be discovered by American media. Early reports had been made late in the Johnson administration, but these stories failed to gain traction. American journalists in Southeast Asia began speaking with aid workers, CIA contractors, and Laotian refugees, and began reporting the bombing raids coming out of Thailand. As the administration began to receive more questions from journalists, they tried to obfuscate the answers by talking about the number of U.S. personnel who were killed rather than the number of Americans, with the White House not wanting to give Democrats any political ammunition ahead of the 1970 midterms. The issue was not to obtain the fact. They were widely known, but to induce the government to confirm them publicly. The issue for us was to what extent an official acknowledgement of our operations in Laos would wreck what was left of the 1962 Accords, give Hanoi a pretext for further stepping up its aggression in northern Laos, and fuel even more passionate controversy at home. From the critics' point of view, the issue was useful for a challenge to the whole Vietnam enterprise. Some would even have considered it a bonus if a collapse in Laos had led to a collapse in Vietnam. They wanted not facts, but ammunition. As the American public became more interested in the operations in Laos and Cambodia, Congress began investigating the administration, including congressmen who had been aware of Operation Momentum for a decade, trying to deflect blame from themselves. Comparably, Laos was the target of more bombings than Cambodia, but it was the attacks on the latter that drew more public outrage. The American public, by and large, remained uninterested in the kingdom, at least as compared with Cambodia and Vietnam. Americans held no massive rallies to protest Laos policy. No contingent of anti-war celebrities traveled to Laos to highlight the war there, and no famous musicians held concerts to benefit Laotian refugees or Laotian fighters. Congress passed the Cooper Church Amendment in December of 1970, which forbid the use of American ground troops in Laos or Cambodia. Despite escalating the war and the subsequent public ire, the Nixon administration was looking for a way out of Vietnam, even if it threw its regional allies under the bus. To be fair, the Nixon administration was dealing with a hostile Congress, with a Senate that was debating an amendment that would call for setting a date for withdrawal of U.S. troops. The ideal bargaining position would have existed if our public had trusted our goals and our enemy had been uncertain about our tactics. Our domestic discord produced exactly the opposite state of affairs. During the talks, the North Vietnamese insisted that any ceasefire between themselves and the U.S. would not apply in Laos and Cambodia, and refused to address the latter two countries until a deal in South Vietnam was agreed and signed. And despite his ties in Laos, Bill Sullivan made no efforts during the negotiations for protections for the Hmong or other anti-communist fighters. The final deal was agreed to in late 1972, which had North Vietnam agree to a ceasefire and to not traffic men or arms through Laos and Cambodia, even though Hanoi had continued to maintain the political fiction that all North Vietnamese soldiers in Laos were actually volunteers, and thus legally their actions didn't count as violations of the new Paris Accords. The record leaves no doubt that we were looking for excuses to make the negotiations succeed, not to fail. U.S. officials would pressure both Laos and Cambodia to sign separate peace deals with North Vietnam as well, ones which the local government saw as not providing sufficient protection, and when they voiced their concerns, the Nixon administration threatened to withdraw all foreign aid from these countries, which forced them to sign the deals. The deal between North Vietnam and Laos required the withdrawal of foreign troops by June of 1973, but similar to the issues of the 1962 Geneva Accord, the Pathet Lao refused to allow outsiders to inspect their territory to verify them, and the halting of bombing had allowed North Vietnam to increase traffic through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Prime Minister Pham Minh had naively believed that Prince Souphanophong had negotiated on behalf of the Pathet Lao in good faith, but the poor deal led to rumors of a potential coup. Pham Minh would visit France in July of 1973 for medical treatment, which functionally left the country under the control of Prince Souphanophong, who would allow the Pathet Lao to orchestrate strikes and protests across the country, with the demand to fire corrupt officials, which ended up being everyone who wouldn't go along with a communist takeover of the country. This would trigger a coup attempt by a group of Laotian exiles in Thailand, led by former Air Force General Thao Ma, who had fled the country back in the 60s with former Defense Minister Phoumy Sullivan. He attacked the Vantage airport with 60 men and bombed the army headquarters outside the capital, but the plane would crash, with Thao Ma and his men being captured. The failed coup was used as a justification to purge the government of anybody associated with the Laotian right. The National Political Consultative Council would be created in September of 1973, which would supplant the authority of Parliament, which Souphanophong would take control of. The Pathet Lao were allowed to integrate into the military and police, giving them positions of authority over local governments across the country, and labeled anybody who opposed them as warmongers. Phauma didn't return to Laos until February of 1975, but by that point he was so physically weak, he functionally gave control of the government to the Pathet Lao. On April 13th, King Savangfatana was pressured to sign a decree to dissolve Parliament, with no future elections scheduled, which were followed by a series of anti-American demonstrations organized across Laos in May, demanding the resignation of the few remaining rightist ministers, most of whom fled the country along with Veng Pao. The Pathet Lao would take over the royalist capital of Luang Prabang, along with much of the south over the course of the summer. The police were abolished in July, with the Pathet Lao taking over their responsibilities. By this point, South Vietnam had fallen, and thus North Vietnam didn't participate in the final conquest of Laos, needing their troops to occupy Saigon. Southern Laos was hostile to the Pathet Lao, leading to the communists to move slowly in their takeover of local governments. The Pathet Lao continued to publicly proclaim loyalty to the king, all the while sending army officers to re-education camps, and holding show trials for ministers that had fled the country, sentencing them to death in absentia. After additional pressure, the king would sign a letter abdicating the throne, with the monarchy being abolished on December 2nd, 1975, establishing the Lao People's Democratic Republic. By 1975, at least 200,000 Laotians would die, including 30,000 Hmong, nearly a tenth of the country's population. 750,000 were made refugees from either the bombings or from people fleeing communist persecution. 300,000 Laotians fled to Thailand after the communist victory, while the surviving Hmong waged an insurgency against the North Vietnamese, which resulted in an additional 40,000 dead. The members of the royal family would be arrested and sent to labor camps, with most of them never being heard from again. If you have any questions about the video or future topic suggestions, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. And if you want to dig deeper into the topics of this video yourself, my sources, as well as all my footnotes, are also listed down in the description. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, I would appreciate it if you'd take time to fill out my 2025 audience survey, linked in the description. I'd also like to thank my newest patrons and channel members for supporting Casual Historian: Teo, Razfam, Ashton, John, and John. Their support allows me to keep making videos even when YouTube or sponsors are uncomfortable with the topics. If you're interested in learning some more Southeast Asian history, then I suggest watching this video about post-war Vietnam that I put out last year. Or you could watch my latest video here. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.